Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about graphic design as cultural production. Today on the show, I am talking to somebody who I have wanted on Scratching the Surface basically since I started it. Zak Kyes is with me today. Zak is the founder and creative director of Zak Group, a London-based design studio that works with cultural and commercial clients like Nike, M+, Frank Ocean, Virgil Abloh, and Fact. Zak is a graduate of CalArts, and from 2006 to 2016, he was the art director of the Architectural Association School of Architecture, where he worked on a wide range of design and publishing projects. While at the AA, he co-curated with Mark Owens the really fascinating exhibition Forms of Inquiry, the Architecture of Critical Graphic Design in 2007, which was, I think, the first time I came across Zak's work. That show in particular had a really big influence on me and my understanding of what graphic design could be. And this, in many ways, shapes this conversation. Zak's work, while firmly rooted in graphic design, sees design as a type of cultural practice. So in this episode, Zak and I talk about how design shapes culture and how our own definitions of graphic design and culture are evolving. We talk about the Forms of Inquiry exhibition and how that influenced a generation of designers, as well as kind of changed how we might think of critical graphic design. We also talk about what he learned while working with architects at the AA and where he sees Zak Group going next. Zak Group is a really interesting design studio, and Zak's practice, I think, is really unique and fascinating. And so it was so nice to hear him talk about his work and the evolution of the studio. If you like this show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to sign up. Thank you, as always, for your support, and here is me with Zak Kyes. In preparing for this, I watched a talk that you gave in 2019. The YouTube video was called "Good Design Is ... and your talk was Think Today, Finish Tomorrow is what the title was. And it was sort of this like retroactive manifesto of your studio, Zak Group. And the first point of that manifesto is give shape to culture. And to me, that perfectly encapsulates your entire career, your entire practice. And so I'd like to start there with this idea of design giving shape to culture. And I'm curious if you could kind of talk about what that means to you and what that means for the studio, and then also where you arrived at that idea, because that seems like a thread that's been there from the beginning in your work.
If I think about the kind of trajectory of the studio, a lot of our early work focused on working with artists and working with designers and architects. I worked for a number of years in an architecture school, and there what I found is that there were a lot of architects whose work was essentially looked very much like graphic design. And I was interested in finding ways to kind of borrow from those ways of working, and see how graphic design could be a tool to kind of, as we say, give shape to culture. I think that as a designer, we're often using other people's words and other people's images to kind of visualize or give form to something. And for us, design is really a practice that can give shape to culture rather than simply representing it.
I think that's a really interesting difference. I just want to hear you elaborate on more of giving shape to culture versus representing it. How do you see those as two different acts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if we go back to kind of where we started, which was really looking at the possibility of books as a way to give shape to culture. What I was really interested in, going back to the example I mentioned earlier of the Architectural Association, which is a school of architecture in London. there's like a rich tradition in architecture of architects who made kind of hypothetical and immaterial
Hmm.
proposals. And most often, those proposals took the form not of buildings, but of books.
Right,
And
right,
so, what was super interesting for me to realize is that architects took the publication kind of as their site, essentially. Um,
right.
and for me, that was something kind of fundamentally different than simply representing something that exists out in the world back in the space of a book. And so that kind of thinking is something that we've tried to um, apply to the way in which we approach design and how we think about it.
To keep the conversation on Zak Group for a second, you started that right out of school, right? You finished at you got a BFA at CalArts in 2005. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
And
Yeah.
and you basically started the studio immediately, and it was kind of running in parallel to your time at the AA. And a couple years ago, I guess like 5, 6 years ago now, you left the AA and kind of focused solely on Zak Group. And I'm curious about that and kind of what you thought you could do, keeping this idea of shaping culture in devoting all your time to the studio. What was sort of the thought process there, and what were you kind of hoping to do with the studio at that time?
Yeah. So that period kind of marked a transition for me. The studio always worked within the realm of arts and culture,
Hmm.
and what we started to find was, I guess, through a number of experiences of similar types of projects that always have their kind of inbuilt, let's say, limitations or limitations in terms of scale or possibilities. Um, we became very interested in kind of expanding our view of what culture is. So
Mm,
in the beginning, we really thought of culture. I really thought of culture as art and architecture. And of course, I realized that it's impossible to stop there. So if
right.
you look at culture, like maybe with a lowercase c in a wider sense, then it becomes super interesting to think about, culture. There's this great McLuhan quote, which is that culture is what most of the people are doing most of the time.
Right, right.
So when we started to look at it through that framework, the possibilities kind of expanded, and that was something that I was very interested to explore with a group of people in the studio, and so that kind of marked my transition out of the Architectural Association after about 10 years.
I really appreciate that answer because you perfectly kind of saw where I was taking this conversation, I think. Because what's interesting to me over the last couple of years at Zak Group is that it has expanded beyond kind of the art and architecture clients that you had previously, and you're working with Frank Ocean, you're working with Nike, you're working with Virgil Abloh. You're moving between not just books, but you're doing brands and spaces, and
Mm.
really expanding both the scale of the projects themselves, but then also the types of clients. And this isn't exactly the same, but I had Michael Rock on the show a couple years ago, and I talked to him about 2x4 who had a similar trajectory where they were working in a kind of more cultural space and really expanded that. And I talked to him about kind of maintaining that original ethos and working on bigger projects. And I'm curious how you think about that, moving from a very narrow view of culture to a bigger view. How does your process change? And then how has it also stayed the same?
It's important for us to think about how it stayed the same because that gives us a kind of framework to imagine like into the future. So
Yeah.
uh, we've always been interested in working with people that through their work guide the trajectory of
Mm,
contemporary culture. So
hmm.
that can be an artist or a Kunsthalle or a brand or
Hmm.
like a cultural figure like Frank Ocean or Virgil Abloh. We see we look at our collaborations through that lens of kind of guiding the course of contemporary culture. So that's how it stayed the same. I think what has changed is, again, perhaps the audiences.
Right.
So the audience for us originally was very well defined, pretty much entirely within the public sector, and now, of course, the audience has kind of expanded, and it's expanded because of the kind of outreach that some of our collaborators have, and also in other ways. Like now, when we think about our audience, I think it falls into a few different categories. I think, of course, there are these amazing cultural figures that are really
Mhm.
through their own practice changing the way that we understand culture. There are also brands that are
Mhm.
definitely contributing to culture as we kind of understand it and live it on a daily basis. Um, and then importantly, there's also another audience, which is people that don't yet know that they're designers. Um, and
Mhm.
and that's an area that's really interesting for us because, of course, that's like the next generation of kind of design talent, um,
Yeah.
and that's something really important to focus on, I think.
It's interesting that you say that too, because something I was thinking about in thinking about you and thinking about this conversation and especially thinking about this idea of sort of design as cultural production, I've found this is a little bit of a blanket statement, but I found that designers, graphic designers specifically, who are interested in these ideas that you're talking about, often find themselves kind of pushing up against against the definitions of what is graphic design. I include myself in here also, and they want to
Mhm.
move into other things. They want to move into filmmaking or writing or
Yeah,
I mean podcasting in my case, teaching, curating these types of things. You've done that a little bit, but you seem to really be rooted in being a graphic designer. And again, I don't mean to kind of put definitions or borders around this, but you've built a studio that seems to be able to wrestle with these ideas within a framework of graphic design. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how you think about kind of retaining that description of being a graphic designer?
sure. Brings up a few different things like how I became a graphic designer. Maybe that's another area. But I mean, within the studio, um, we don't really think about it in terms of is this graphic design or is this not graphic design. For us, I mean, we really think about ourselves. This might sound stupid, but as a design office.
Mm,
So not like an atelier, let's say, but really a place where kind of work is done and that work is design, and the exact form or nature that it takes is is kind of up for consideration. And in a sense, I mean, the name of the studio is Zak Group, and that refers to the kind of group of people that are working here, but also the group of people that we collaborate with. And
right.
more and more, we want to think about the studio as a kind of, let's say, creative infrastructure, for lack of a better word, um,
Mm,
whose abilities can kind of be amplified through collaborations. And we're interested in joining forces with other people um, to create something kind of bigger than ourselves. We really don't want to be limited by a kind of an individual vision of a designer.
right.
Um, and so then when it comes to graphic design, uh, more and more often we are working kind of across lanes. So we're, of course, trained as
Hmm.
graphic designers, but we're working with architects on kind of spatial interventions, on furniture in some cases. So the kind of output can really vary, but we definitely look at it through a kind of lens and training of graphic design.
And that makes perfect sense to me. And I think of something like when you're at the AA and started Bedford Press, and now you have this project Group Object where you are very clearly coming from the position of graphic design, but actually kind of creating or working with people to put cultural objects out into the world. How do you think about that collaboration and when it's something that a client that's kind of coming to you with an idea versus something that you think should kind of go out into the world? Is there a difference between those things?
I don't really believe in kind of the separation of client projects and self-initiated projects, because at the end of the day, we decide what we want to dedicate our time to, and
Right, right.
so we're concerned kind of with the outcome. So it doesn't necessarily matter to us where the idea comes from. Um, and we can also be our own worst client. So it doesn't make it any easier if it's self-initiated.
Right, right. That makes sense. You mentioned in that previous answer about uh, kind of how you became a designer or how you got interested in design, and I'm curious about that. I saw in some of my research, I saw that you had started studying art history for a bit. Can you talk a little bit about where your interest in design came from?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my interest from design actually came at a kind of earlier period, before I went to college.
Mm.
I grew up in Southern California, and we actually had some family friends that left Germany just prior to the war, and they were actually involved in a kind of not a Nazi resistance. So
Mm.
they managed to escape, and these were family friends that we would see relatively regularly. And I remember at one point they were saw that I was interested in art, and they said, "Oh, do you know this friend of ours who passed away some years ago, Herbert Bayer?" And he actually lived in this small town in California, and of course I knew nothing about Bayer, but
Wow, wow.
through this kind of weird chance encounter, I started to like see his. They gave me his books, and I discovered like the Bauhaus in this
Yeah,
kind of
that's
sun
amazing.
bleached Southern California kind of landscape. And this was like such an interesting. And then I later discovered that there were works by Herbert Bayer in the town that I grew up in, but that I had seen many times but never really thought about. And so this kind of took me out of my kind of geography and my immediate context. And I think there would have been no one better than Bayer to discover,
Yeah,
because he had such an expansive practice, which
yeah,
challenges many of the notions that you're mentioning earlier about what a
yeah.
designer is.
I mean, did you, as somebody who was interested in art and then seeing Herbert Bayer, did you see d h can you talk about, like, why that clicked for you, I guess, or, like, why that suddenly seemed like something that was very interesting to you?
Yeah, it clicked to me because it, Herbert Bayer had a really expansive practice that wasn't limited uh, simply by one discipline. So that kind of model seemed really interesting. And I at that point, I didn't even make a distinction between graphic design or industrial
Right,
design, etc.
right.
It just I became interested in that world. I discovered the Bauhaus. In the
Mhm.
end, what it made me want to do was study art history, which turned out to be a little bit of a detour on my path to becoming a designer. But I think really everybody should study art history, because art history is like really the history of ideas and creativity. So
Yeah,
it was definitely a good decision. I studied art history for a year. I immersed myself, in mostly in the library, looking at books, and then I started to also like realize like that these amazing books actually had to have been designed by someone, and
right,
and that person was a graphic designer. And so that was then the kind of next step, which is realizing that these books are not about the graphic designers that have designed them, but they are given shape by a
right.
graphic designer. And that then really clicked, and then I decided, okay, I need to find a school where I can actually study this.
That is such an amazing story, Zach, that's so funny. How do you think I agree with you that everybody should study art history. I've thought many times that I would love to go back to school just to focus on art history, uh, because of the kind of just art history classes that I took in between my other
Mm.
programs. How do you think that 1 year studying art history, how did that influence how you then, when you went into graphic design, influence how you kind of approached your design studies, or kind of having that background, spending that time in that library? Do you think that brought something different to your practice or your approach that you may have otherwise not have had?
Well, I think the one thing that it might have changed is I graphic design itself wasn't the thing that kind of primarily attracted me. What
Hmm.
I was really interested in was uh, a kind of broader creative practice and communicating this to an audience. And kind of translating these ideas into a form. Um, so when I came to study graphic design, um, I had also done other things. I had been part of like an art collective, and I
Mm.
really saw graphic design as kind of like a tool or an interface, or even kind of like a passport, because it allowed you to, as a graphic designer, kind of trespass into different fields, which you probably couldn't do if you were if you had another role or a job. That's one of the really exciting things about graphic design. So perhaps um, that changed my outlook and also my interests.
I think that's right. And I love that idea of graphic design as a passport. I can't tell you how many times these types of ideas have come up on the show, especially when I'm talking to design writers who say something to the effect of I wanted to write about design because I realized that through design I could kind of write about anything.
Hmm.
Looking back, I feel like that's kind of how I got into graphic design, is because I was just somebody who was interested in a lot of different things, and graphic design was the thing that happened to connect all of those or touched all of those in some way. I'm curious about your time at the AA, at the Architecture Association. You were there for 10 years, and I think architecture also is another field that is often treated like a passport, to
Yeah.
continue your metaphor. And going back to the beginning of this conversation of seeing these architects who were making books and doing these kind of speculative projects. And I'm curious about what you took from that experience and what you took from kind of working with architects and seeing architects and sort of the architectural approach, how that had an influence on how you thought about your work there.
When I started working at the AA, it was still very kind of early in my practice as a graphic designer. I was like in my early 20s, and I was just keen to understand kind of the possibilities of design. So the AA was in a way like my MFA, I guess. I really
Mm.
learned a lot about design there, and um, it also happened through who I met and how I arrived there. The one thing that I think you need to understand about the Architectural Association is that it's essentially a bar, like it's a Victorian house that has a bar in
Mm.
it, and like the teaching is kind of peripheral. It happens in these other rooms, but it's really a kind of social space. And there, I met many architects um, who were not making buildings. They were curating. They were creating books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were creating work that looked a lot like graphic design. So I was looking at it already through that lens, and what I then later discovered. My first project arriving at the AA was to make a book with an architect, David Green, who is a member of Archigram.
Mm.
Um, and Archigram, of course, is very well known for um, creating these kind of wild, futuristic, hypothetical visions of the future that were unbuildable, and took the form essentially of a magazine. Archigram was a magazine,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and so there I understood how media and imagery could, for architects, become a kind of architectural site. And I was really interested in trying to understand how, as a graphic designer, I could try to borrow from this kind of conceptual toolbox
Mm-hmm.
um, of architecture. And so there were many different projects that I did there that tried to tackle that question. Um, Architecture, by its very definition, has to work across lanes and has to kind of include a huge team of people. So I was very interested in finding ways to explore some of these ideas within my own practice as a graphic designer.
Yeah, and one I apologize now for asking you a
Mm-hmm.
series of questions about a project that you did almost 15 years ago at this point. But one of those projects, one of those ways that I think speaks to what you're talking about, was the show and publication you worked on with Mark Owens, The Architecture of
Mm-hmm.
Critical Design, which is something that meant a lot to me when it came out. I was in college when that came out, and I remember seeing images of it. I can't exactly remember where I came across it, but it was something I just fell in love with, and is when I first kind of discovered you and your work. And I think it's interesting to think about that project in retrospect, because I think in preparing for this, I read a bunch of reviews of it that seemed to misunderstand what you were trying to do with it. But can you talk about how that project came about, and those kind of connections that you were trying to make between architectural practice and graphic design practice in that show and in that publication?
Sure, sure. So forms of inquiry was again kind of like my swimming lessons. As a young designer, it became a bigger part of my life than I had expected it would be. Um, but what I was really interested in, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was to find ways to borrow from this kind of toolbox of architecture and uh, try to think about how, because I saw architecture and design as a way of kind of processing the world around us, and I wanted to see if we could borrow some of these ideas of speculative proposals, of research, of paper architecture from graphic design, from architecture, and bring it into the kind of field of graphic design. It was also, quite honestly, about inventing an opportunity where it did not exist.
Mm,
So the exhibition in itself was kind of a speculative proposal. Maybe that wasn't how it was interpreted, when it sort of tours around the world, but that's really how it started. And in this exhibition, we invited a number of graphic designers to create what we called an inquiry. So this was a kind of
mm,
research into architecture, culture, or history. And we would exhibit this research, and then there was also a kind of poster or print that went along with that research. And this toured for several years. It became more successful than I had imagined. And as you say, mentioning these reviews, it was also a kind of trial by fire,
yeah.
and you never quite forget your first trauma. But it was interesting to be like at that stage in my practice, and to be on this kind of international stage, I suppose, and have positions to defend. So I really learned quite a lot
Mm,
about this, both through kind of positive and negative criticism from kind of industry figures. Um, but I think that this was like the start of a trajectory that has continued in how you can kind of port ideas. In technology, there's this great concept of porting, where you take
mm-hmm.
something that's or adapt software from one environment into another. And so this was kind of an example for me of how we could port something from architecture to graphic design. And this is something that we're definitely still interested in exploring.
I'm interested in how that has influenced the work since, but I think one of the kind of misinterpretations of it was this term critical design. That this was somehow related to or in response to kind of the Dun and Raby idea, and you and Mark were kind of doing something completely different. And I'm not asking you to like relitigate those critiques or to like defend yourself or anything like that, but I'm curious about that term critical design, because I think that is a term in the years since, and especially today, has just lost all meaning at this point. It is an aesthetic, or it is just something that is kind of seen as like trendy, or as some sort of subgenre of design. And I'm curious about why that term was kind of interesting to you. And I should clarify, you don't ever kind of call it as a thing. You don't actually say this is critical or this is critical design. What can you just talk about that a little bit, and kind of how you think about that, the evolution of that term?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, critical graphic design has become kind of almost a meme.
Yeah, yeah.
And si- since we uh, since we worked on this exhibition, when we used the words critical and graphic design together, what we were trying to express and what we were interested in are graphic designers that are trying to kind of question or reframe the conditions or circumstances surrounding graphic design. And there are a number of different ways that has been done. Some of
Mm-hmm.
those take on the form of self-initiated projects. Others kind of combine design and writing, as you yourself are
Mm-hmm.
doing.
Mm-hmm.
So this was maybe more about kind of interrogating the possibilities and questioning the circumstances and expectations around graphic design. There is another kind of school of thought that Dunn and Raby, who we later worked with on different projects, are kind of theorizing, but our
Yeah.
intention was really to look at how we as graphic designers can question the circumstances surrounding our work.
Again, I'm sorry to keep like bringing this up, but I think that was like the piece that was lost in a lot of those kind of early reviews. But what I think is really interesting is that show really captured a feeling that a lot of designers were having at that time. I really always associate that show with dot dot dot, which I think was kind of doing something similar, or and they were in the show, but they were kind of also kind of questioning what it meant to be a graphic designer. And I think between Forms of Inquiry and dot 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 and kind of the other people who were featured in both of those, it really had a profound influence on the next generation of designers who maybe were not satisfied with the way graphic design had been practiced or talked about before, and really opened up the field in a lot of ways. And I count myself in that, and I count this show as something that kind of came out of that thinking. And I mean, so kind of bring this back full circle, I just have a couple questions to begin to wrap this up. We began the conversation talking about how design gives shapes to culture and how this has been a part of your work from the beginning, and how over the last couple of years the studio has really started to expand and rethink what culture is and can be. I'm interested in where that goes. Like, what's next for you? What's next for the studio? What are the things you're excited about that you haven't maybe gotten to work in, or spaces that you want to think more about? Where do you see all of this going next?
There are a lot of areas that we're really interested in focusing on in the future. Um, one of the areas is to uh, think about the studio as kind of an educational model, or
Mm.
to I gave a lecture a while back that you referenced earlier, where we presented a kind of manifesto, and it was a bit tongue in cheek because I don't necessarily believe in the self
Right.
assuredness of manifestos. But one of the points that we had there was to open source ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, that's really interesting to think about how uh, we as a design studio can try to kind of open up this black box of design in a design studio. Um,
Mm-hmm.
with most black boxes, you kind of know what goes in and you know what comes out, but you have no idea what happens inside. And I think by kind of open sourcing how we work as a studio, that can really level the playing field for the kind of next generation of designers. So bringing people that don't know that they're designers or young designers into the fold is something that we're really interested in. Kind of
Mm.
related to that, we recently launched a scholarship with Central St.
Yeah.
Martin's called the
Yeah.
Zak Group Future Forward Scholarship. And this is in kind of a related effort to try to expand opportunities within our industry. I think we're a very undiverse industry.
Mm-hmm.
And as the director of a design studio, I consider it really my responsibility to address this kind of imbalance. So that's what led us to do the scholarship, which I'm really excited about. I think how we can be most effective is to find ways to increase the kind of funnel to design education and
Yeah.
hopefully also design occupations later down the line.
I love that. I agree. I think the scholarship is such a great idea, and I wanted to come back to this idea of open sourcing the process as another point of that, because I think that's really important. I think another way that you do that is through your collaborations, and there was a show about your work that you called Zak
Mhm.
Kyes Working With, which I thought was such a great way to show how a graphic designer works, instead of just showing kind of
Mhm.
finished projects, but actually bringing in the collaborators and talking about collaboration as a key to your own process. how we've talked kind of around this idea of collaboration through this entire conversation. How does collaboration fit into your process? It seems like it's everything. Can you talk about kind of the importance of collaboration in your work?
Yeah, collaboration is really the kind of foundation of our work. I think it's hard to work
Mm-hmm.
without being in collaboration with someone or something. So when I did that exhibition, Zak Kyes working with, what I was interested in is to present graphic design as a collaborative practice and try to kind of unpack um, this idea of what a designer is. And for me, a designer is not a kind of creative visionary that is working autonomously,
Mm-hmm.
but is someone who is taking on many different inputs, processing the world around himself or herself, and that is not a one-way street. I mean, I think when I first probably started studying graphic design, I probably thought that design is a kind of one-way street, and I realized that it, of
Mm.
course, is not. It's a dialogue, um, and that was the idea behind this exhibition. So it included all of the people that I consider as essentially part of my work. So that's something that we've always tried to highlight, and also something that we try to be really direct and honest about by always crediting. And it's important, I think, to highlight that there are, design is not the product of an individual. It's the product of a group of people working together. So that's really important for us to kind of keep in mind.
This is not a question that I was thinking I was going to ask you, and I'm not even sure if it's an interesting question, Zach, to be honest. And if it turns out to not be interesting, we can cut it out. But thinking about this idea of collaboration and thinking about kind of highlighting the collaborators and highlighting the conversation and the dialogue, what's really interesting to me about your work is, yes, that collaboration, but also how visible the studio is, that a lot of your projects are kind of presented as collaborations. So it's not just, for example, the Nike Virgil Abloh book is just like, this is a Nike Virgil Abloh book, but that Zak Group is a part of that. That it is not the invisible designer, but the designer is part of a larger creative team. How do you think about that, about being a visible part of it, that the design of the artifact itself is as important, or is equally interesting as the content, or in dialogue with the content? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Sure. I think what you're getting at is that as designers, we are not simply kind of relaying a message, but or representing the kind of work that someone else is creating, but that we're also creating kind of a cultural object in our own right, and that we bring a lot to the table in that process.
Right.
Um, of course, it takes on, we definitely modulate that. There are some times where,
Right.
we simply help an artist realize something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're definitely happy to work in that way. And there are other times in which, we work more as a kind of thought partner
Right.
and help develop ideas. And sometimes those result in a kind of graphic design project or a designed object. And in some cases, it simply is part of a kind of wider research, or kind of feeds into creative direction. So yeah, I would say that, like, thinking about ourselves um, as a kind of potential partner that can work both in a really thoughtful way, but also a really immediate way is important. And by immediate, I mean that we can kind of like think and do. There's this great quote by Martin Kippenberger, which is "Think today, finish tomorrow," and this has
Right.
always been the kind of
Right.
unofficial studio mantra, which is that you can spend a day thinking and then a day doing.
Yeah.
And there's like no bullshit, and this is really
Yeah.
our kind of ultimate goal.
In a weird way, that brings this conversation full circle and kind of goes back to everything that we were talking about. And so I'll end with the question that I use to end all of these interviews. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
What am I reading? I just finished a few books that I've been working on for a long time. One is the Robert Moses's Power Broker.
Oh, great! I love that book.
Which is one of the books that's been on my nightstand for a long time.
Yeah.
I was also like on a biographical trip recently. There is a new Warhol biography that came out
Yeah.
that was really fantastic. And and this is maybe like a less interesting example, but also the news. I mean, I think this past year has been, we can't really have a conversation without kind of talking about what has happened in the past year. I think we've like realized the extent to which, kind of socially we are divided, and how kind of unequal the world is. And that has been something that I think one can't escape this year. And this past year was reading all of that and really following the news, really made us kind of pause and kind of reassess. So that would be kind of another thing that I've been reading.
Zak, as I said at the beginning, I'm a longtime fan of your work and the studio's work and how you approach design and how you think about graphic design. And it was so nice to talk to you about these things and how you think about them and your process. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
This episode was recorded on May 21st, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.